1.5 years ago, I made a video to compare the Sonos Beam Gen 2 to the Sonos Arc. The decision at that point in time wasn't easy, and it boiled down to a couple of factors, including the space that you had, the TV size, your budget, the sound quality that you were after, but ultimately the choice was down to your wife. Because in 99% of the cases, you just buy whatever your wife tells you to buy. 1.5 years later, those of you with still the same wife will still end up with the same decisions. Those of you who bought the other soundbar that your wife didn't choose probably ended up with another wife. But wives aside, there are a few things that have changed in the last 18 months that have passed, and I thought I'd better make a new video to update this decision-making process for 2023 and beyond. Now first, upfront summary. It's heavy. Upfront summary, just get the Arc, right? The Sonos Arc. Now, not enough money, save up more. TV too small, upgrade the TV. Room too small, move the setup to a bigger room. No bigger room, move house. Wife don't allow, change wife. Why? Because of the possibility of integrating the new Sonos Era 300. Now, if you have your answer from this upfront summary already, please go ahead and exit the video. Tell your wife, Peter said to buy the Sonos Arc. If you are a salesman trying to convince your customer to spend more at this very moment, show them this video. Now, all the men in the world need someone else to back their decision. So, hello wives, my name is Peter and I am your worst nightmare. Yeah. So, if you are not busy preparing your divorce settlement at this point after deciding to get the Sonos Arc, please do stick around and let me talk you through my decision-making process. Now, like I said, there are a couple of things that have changed since the last video, which makes me want to state in no unclear terms that you need to get the Sonos Arc. But first, there are things to talk about, and those are the things that hasn't changed. Now, the Beam is half the price of the Sonos Arc. It costs about $450 US. It is also about half the size. Now, it supports Atmos through an eARC HDMI port at the rear. It has 5 drivers and 3 passive radiators. Sound is decent, simulated surround is good. Now, Atmos effect is also simulated with phase array technology, where it tricks your brains into thinking that sound is coming from the top when there aren't actually any upward firing drivers on the Beam Gen 2 itself. So the Arc, this Arc, is twice the price of the Sonos Beam at $900. It is also about twice the length of the Beam Gen 2. Let me see if I can show. Never mind. All right, so at this point, look at the wife and ask her if longer is better while discreetly thrusting your hips forward ever so slightly. Now, the sound is a lot more spacious from the Sonos Arc and has a wider soundstage than the Sonos Beam by virtue of the fact that the soundbar is longer. There are a total of 11 drivers on the Sonos Arc, with 2 firing 90 degrees off to the side for a more immersive surround sound on its own, and 2 more actual upward firing speakers towards the ceiling for true Atmos effects. Now, all 11 of the drivers are powered actively and none of them are passive radiators. Now, bass and sound is thus better controlled and there's less boom in the bass department. Now, none of these have changed in the course of the last 18 months. In fact, it is not what has changed or not changed with the soundbars themselves that has prompted this remake of the comparison video. Now, it is what has changed within the ecosystem. Now, I've always loved how Sonos stuff works in a modular way. You can add the subs and the surrounds as and when you need them, or when budget allows, or when the wife decides to indulge you. Now, there are 3 major events that have happened in the last 18 months that will change the decision. Now, first, is the launch of the Sonos Ray. I don't have the Sonos Ray with me right now. Now, before this, the decision was simple. Lower budget, go for the Beam. Higher budget, go for the Arc. Now, with the introduction of the Ray, various features were cut out to create a lower budget soundbar, exclusion of a HDMI port, less drivers, smaller build, and most notably, lack of Atmos support. At the asking price of $279, it bordered on a waste of time and seemed to be like a soundbar that Sonos should have made in 2010, not 2022. It is a soundbar that is probably about a decade late to the game. Now, with the introduction of the Ray as the lowest cost option, wives now have two options to choose from. And when decisioning based on budget, the Ray will always win because cheaper. The Sonos Arc represents a significant price bump, even though it is twice the price of the Beam, but it has greater value. But the difference between the Ray and the Beam Gen 2 is both smaller in absolute as well as relative terms. Now, getting the Beam doesn't sound like you're getting entry into the Sonos Club, and there will always be this nagging feeling that you have that, what could you have done, with the Sonos Arc? But buying the Arc is a solid decision that will separate the men from the boys. Now, this is probably a pretty weak decisioning point, but it's a point nonetheless. Now, the second thing, which is important, that has happened since 1.5 years ago, is much more significant. The introduction of the Sub Mini right here. Now, previously, you would have thought that if you wanted a Sub, you are much better off buying the Arc because the Sub costs $800, and buying that with a $450 soundbar sounds like a wrongful allocation of budget. It is like your wife carrying a Hermes bag but walking around with a Casio G-Shock. The G-Shock is great value, functional, but maybe the Charles & Keith bag would have been a better match. But with the introduction of the Sub Mini at $429, suddenly the Sonos Beam Gen 2 seems to have fallen in line with the whole value proposition. Now let's do the math. For $900 you could get this Beam Gen 2 with the Sub Mini, or you could just get the Sonos Arc on its own. Now, the Beam Gen 2 with Sub Mini represents an insane amount of value, and the sound coming out from the combination will leave no one wanting more. Now, this will be the best $900 to spend on any Sonos system, and that still remains true to this date in March of 2023. If you're in search of value, you can stop right here. And if you are trying to convince the missus on the value of this, just offer the choice of the Sonos Arc on its own or the Beam Gen 2 with a Sub Mini, and the choice will always be the Beam. But I have to say one thing, Sonos owners aren't always about value for money. We don't always get swayed by a $20 savings with this option or $100 drop in price if we choose another option. Now, if we wanted value, there's no lack of choices of budget soundbars at Best Buy or Target or Harvey Norman, whichever place you are at, which goes for a lot less money than $900. Now, before you label me as a snob, I have to say there's a place for every piece of equipment, every budget. I personally have a $20 Ugreen earbuds, which I still listen to because of the great sound to value proposition that it offers. So it's really not about the price, nor the snob factor. It is about whether there is an option to allow you to go all the way out to get the best of the best, the greatest of all time setup without regard to value. And that, my friends, brings us to the third and the final change that has happened in the past 18 months to affect my decisioning Beam versus Arc discussion. Now let's recap a little bit. Now the first was the Sonos Ray, the budget edition of a soundbar at the low end. Second, the Sub Mini, a smaller, lower budget edition of a Sub. Now the third and the last is the recent announcement of the new Sonos Era speakers. Now Sonos announced the Era 100 and the 300 in the March of 2023. Now the Era 100 replaces the Sonos One, which can still be used as surround speakers for the Ray, the Beam, and the Arc, even the Sonos M, if you are using the M as the main setup for your home theater. But the star of the show is really the Era 300 speakers. Now the Sonos Era 300 speakers has 6 drivers, and one of them is an actual upward firing driver. Now, these two can be deployed as surround speakers. When they are used as surround speakers for the Sonos Beam Gen 2 and the Sonos Arc, the Sonos home theater system adds another 2 channels of heights to your sound mix. So 4 of the drivers on the Sonos Era 300 fires sideways. Now, as surround speakers, they throw out an insanely wide sound stage, opening up a huge rear sound stage which upends anything that Sonos has been able to offer to date. The Sonos 1s, they couldn't achieve this level of immersion with either the Beam nor the Arc. The 5s couldn't, the older Play 3s, they were louder, but they still didn't manage to create a level of immersion that the Era 300 will be capable of creating. Now, nothing in the IKEA Symphonics lineup could do this either. The Era 300 is the ultimate surround speaker created by Sonos. Problem: they cost $449 each, which simply means that each of the Era 300 is going to cost the same as the Beam Gen 2 itself, and you need 2 of them to complete the surround setup. So the Beam Gen 2 itself has no upward firing drivers. See, nothing on the top. In theory, the 2 upward firing drivers on the Era 300 adds 2 actual drivers, so that's great. But if you are choosing the Beam Gen 2, you have to triple your outlay to add 2 Era 300s to the setup. Now, the pricing disparity between the Beam and the surround setup is really too high to justify to any sane buyer. But if you really want the best surround effects, you will then need the Era 300s. And if you want the Era 300s, the only soundbar to match it with is the $900 soundbar in the form of the Sonos Arc. Now, I'm not matching the setup based on price. That would be just plain silly. I am still running through extensive testing and a review of the Era's 100 and the 300 in various configurations. But before my full review comes out with my verdict on the Era 100 and the 300 for music and movies, just take it from me that you will want a 7.2.4 setup from Sonos. Now, what is 7.2.4 setup? It means that there are 7 gear level channels, front, left and right, center, and rear, left and right, and side, left and right surround. The 2.2 refers to the subwoofers, meaning to say you will pair 2 larger Sonos subs to the system. The 0.4 refers to the Atmos channels. 0.2 from the front, which is within the Sonos Arc, and 0.2 from the rear with the Era 300. Now, this system is going to cost you like a lot of money. That's like $3,400 US. In Singapore, where I live, it will cost even more. But the soundstage that you're going to get from that setup is truly worthy of the Sonos badge, and it is truly demonstrative of how good soundbars have come since they were first incepted maybe 20, 30 years ago. Now, sure, there are other options available like the Nakamichi Dragon at this price range, but nothing else out there allows you to build up slowly over time as and when your budget allows and as and when your wife approves. And if this is your goal system, you will need to start with the Sonos Arc. So starting with the Beam Gen 2 will result with an unbalanced soundbar setup in terms of price disparity between the bars and the surround and the sub-components. Now, that's it. If you still think that your wife is right, the Beam isn't a terrible choice. It still supports the Atmos-capable Era 300, and you will finally actually get 2 actual upward-firing Atmos channels from the Era 300s. If your budget for a full setup is about a US $1,400 instead of $3,400 for the greatest of all-time setup, then consider the Beam Gen 2 with the Era 100, a pair of them, and the Sub Mini. Now, this will still be a kick-ass system for about 40% of the cost of the entire ultimate Sonos Arc setup. At $3,400, the Sonos Arc 7.2.4 setup isn't 2.5 times better than the Beam setup. Now, like all audiophile stuff, the higher you climb up the price brackets, the lower the rate of returns in terms of quality. Law of diminishing returns. Now, at the end of the day, do not let your wife know about the existence of the Sonos Ray. The Sonos Ray is a cheaper, non-Atmos capable option from Sonos, and usually the wife stops you at cheaper. But if they find out about the Sonos Ray as a viable option, Don't go about convincing them that it doesn't work with the $900 a pair Era 300 because that will actually seal your fate. You will end up with the Sonos Ray, I guarantee you. The limitation that the Ray doesn't work with the Era 300 is almost like a feature for your wives. Now just tell them nicely that the Ray doesn't have a HDMI port and you will probably need to use optical cable. No, you will need to use optical cable. And the TV remote doesn't integrate as seamlessly and you might end up having to use the phone app to change volume on top of the TV remote. Well, that's not 100% true as Sonos does have an IR repeater function on the Sonos Ray, but maybe half true. Now, this video is not meant to discredit the Beam Gen 2 as a viable home theater option. In fact, I have a full Beam Gen 2 setup with the Sub Mini right here and the Sonos Ones as surrounds. To me, it is a great value system that is still exciting to use and listen to, especially for action-packed movies. Now, I'm suggesting that if you are even considering the Sonos Arc, to go for the Sonos Arc because the new Sonos Era 300 will really change everything. Now, if you would like an in-depth video of my Sonos Beam Gen 2 setup, do check out the video right here where I bought myself a full surround setup with the Sub Mini to be used in my bedroom. And I will see you over in that video.